"What now?" Titus Endor asked as we sat in his private suite aboard the St. Cithus. A female servitor brought us glasses of vintage Amasec, matured in Nalwood casks. "The remnants must be purged," I said. "That's so, and the rest of the heretic fleet. They may have been cheated of their prize, and they may be running now. Perhaps they'll run for years. But they have the resources of a battle group at their disposal and the will to use it. I will recommend we hunt them down and finish this sorry matter once and for all." Amos entered the chamber, made a respectful nod to Endor, and handed me a data slate. "The Admiral's astronavigators have finished plotting the course of the heretic fleet. It matches the estimations Maxilla has just sent me." I scanned the data. "Do you have a chart, Titus?" He nodded and engaged the functions of a glass-topped cogitator unit. The surface glowed, and he entered the reference codes from the slate. So, they're not running back into Imperial space, no surprise, nor out to the lawless distances of the Halo stars. Their course takes them here, 56 Izar, 10 weeks away. In Seruthi territory, right in the heart of Seruthi territory. Lord Inquisitor Rorken nodded gravely. "As you say, brother, this business may be less finished than we thought. They cannot hope to count the Seruthi as allies, or believe they would give them safe haven. The entente between Glor's forces and the Xenos breed was fragile and tenuous, to say the least, and what peace existed between them was ruined by the violence. Datso must have some other reason to head there." Lord Rorken paced the floor of his state chamber, brooding, toying with the signet ring of office on his gloved finger. His flock of cherubs roosted uneasily along the backs of armchairs and couches around the room. Twitching their gargoyle heads from one side to another, they watched me keenly as I stood, waiting for a reply. "My imagination runs wild, Eisenhorn," he said at last. "I intend to question the archaeoxenologist, Malahite, directly. I'm sure he can furnish us with additional intelligence. Just as I'm sure he lacks the capacity to resist, displayed by his aristo master Uracell." Rorken stopped pacing and clapped his gloved hands together with a decisive smack. Startled, the cherubs flew up into the air and began mobbing around the high ceiling. "Horse will be laid for 56 Izar at once," said Lord Rorken, ignoring their lisping squawk. "Bring me your findings without delay." Naval security had imprisoned Girolamo Malahite in the secure wing of the battleship's Medicae facility. The injury I had given him had been treated, but no effort had been made to equip him with a prosthetic limb. I was looking forward to opening his secrets. I passed through the coldly lit infirmary and checked on Fishig. He was still unconscious, though a physician told me his condition was stable. The chastener lay on a plastic-tented cot, wired into wheezing life-supporting pumps and gurgling circulators, his damaged form masked by dressings, anointing charms, and metal bone clamps. From the infirmary, I passed down an unheated main companionway, showed my identification to the duty guards, and entered the forbidding secure wing. I was at a second checkpoint, at the entrance to the gloomy cell block itself, when I heard screaming ringing from a cell beyond. I pushed past the guards and, with them at my heels, reached the greasy iron shutters of the cell. "Open it," I barked, and one of the guards fumbled with his ring of electronic keys. "Quickly, man!" The cell shutter whirred open and locked into its open setting. Conrad Molitor and his 3 hooded acolytes turned to face me, outraged at the interruption. Their surgically gloved hands were wet with pink froth. Behind them, Girolamo Malahite lay whimpering on a horizontal metal cage strung on chains from the ceiling. He was naked, and almost every centimeter of skin had been peeled from his flesh. "Fetch surgeons and physicians, and summon Lord Rorken. Now!" I told the cell guards. "Would you care to explain what you were doing here?" I said to Molitor. He would, I think, have preferred not to answer me, and his trio of retainers looked set to grapple with me and hurl me from the cell. But the muzzle of my auto-pistol was pressed flat against Conrad Molitor's perspiring brow, and none of them dared move. "I am conducting an interview with the prisoner," he began. "Malahite is my prisoner." "He is in the custody of the Inquisition, Brother Eisenhorn." "He is my prisoner, Molitor. Inquisitorial protocol permits me the right to question him first." Molitor tried to back away, but I kept the pressure of the gun firm against his cranium. There was no mistaking the fury in his eyes at this treatment, but he contained it, realizing provocation was the last thing I needed. I was concerned for your health, brother, he began, trying to mollify. The injuries you have suffered, your fatigue. Malahide had to be interrogated with all speed, and thought I would ease your burden by commencing the— Commencing? You've all but killed him. I don't believe your excuse for a moment, Molitor. If you truly intended to help me, you would have asked permission. You wanted his secrets for yourself. A damn lie, he spat. I cocked the pistol with my thumb. In the confines of the iron cell, the click was loud and threatening. Indeed? Then share what you have learned so far. He hesitated. He proved resilient. We have learned little from him. Boots clattered down the cell bay outside, and the guards returned with 2 green-robed fleet surgeons and a quartet of Medicae orderlies. Throne of Terror, one of the surgeons cried, seeing the ruined man on the rack. Do what you can, Doctor. Stabilize him. The physicians hurried to work, calling for tools, apparatus, and cold dressings. Malahide whimpered again. Threatening an Imperial Inquisitor with deadly force is a capital crime, said one of the hooded acolytes, edging forward. Lord Roken will be displeased, said another. Put away your weapon, and our master will cooperate, the third added. Tell your sycophants to be silent, I told Molitor. Please, Inquisitor Eisenhorn, the third acolyte spoke again, his soft voice issuing from the shadows of his cowl. This is an unfortunate mistake. We will make reparations. Put away your weapon. The voice was strangely confident, and in speaking for Molitor, displayed surprising authority. But no more than Amos and Midas would have done for me should the situation have been reversed. Take your assistants and get out, Molitor. We will continue this once I have spoken with Lord Rawkin. The 4 of them left swiftly, and I holstered my weapon. The chief physician came over to me, shaking his head. This man is dead, sir. At Lord Rawkin's request, the warship's senior ecclesiarch provided a great chapel amidships for our use. I think the shipboard courier was impressed by the Lord Inquisitor's fury. We had little time to repair the damage done by the incident, even though the Medicae had placed Malahide's lamentable corpse in a stasis field. Lord Rawkin wanted to conduct the matter himself, but realized he was duty-bound to offer me the opportunity first. To have denied me would have compounded Molitor's insult, even if Rawkin was Lord Inquisitor. I told Rawkin I welcomed the task, adding that my working knowledge of the entire case made me the best candidate. We assembled in the chapel. It was a long hall of fluted columns and mosaic flooring. Stained-glass windows depicting the triumphs of the Emperor were backlit by the Imperium vortex outside the ship. The chamber rumbled with the through-deck vibration of the St. Sithis' churning drive. The facing ranks of pews and the raised stalls to either side were filling with inquisitorial staff and ecclesiarchs. All my brothers were in attendance, even Molitor, who I knew would not be able to stay away. I walked with Loink down the length of the nave to the raised plinth where Malahide lay in stasis. Astropaths, nearly 30 of them, drawn from the ship's complement and the inquisitorial delegation, had assembled behind it. Hooded, misshapen, some borne along on wheeled mechanical frames or carried on litters by dour servitors, they hissed and murmured among themselves. Loink went to brief them. He seemed to relish this moment of superiority over astropaths who normally outranked him. Loink had not the power to manage this rite alone. His resources were enough for only the simplest psychometric audits. But his knowledge of my abilities and practices made him vital in orchestrating their efforts. I looked at Malahide, flayed and pathetic in the shimmering envelope of stasis. Grotesquely, he reminded me of the God Emperor himself, resting for eternity in the great stasis field of the Golden Throne, preserved until the end of time from the death Horus had tried to bestow upon him. Loink nodded to me. The astropathic choir was ready. I looked around and found Endor's face in the congregation. He had placed himself near Molitor, and had promised to watch the bastard closely for me. Shongard sat near the back, disassociating himself from his fellow radical's transgression. I saw Brother Captain Seinwolf and 2 of his awe-inspiring fellow Space Marines take their place behind the altar screen. All of them were in full armor and carried storm bolters. They weren't here for the show. They were here as a safeguard. "Proceed, brother," Lord Rawkin said from his raised seat. The choir began to nurse the folds of the warp apart with their swelling adoration. Psychic cold swept through the vault, and some in the congregation moaned. either in fear or with involuntary empathic vibration. Commodus Voke, helped from his seat by the baleful Haldane, shuffled forward to join me. As a concession to Lord Rawkin for allowing me this honor, I had agreed that the veteran Inquisitor could partake of the auto-seance at my side. The risk was great, after all. 2 minds were better than 1, and in truth, it would be good to have the old reptile's mental power at close hand. "Lower the stasis field," I said. The moaning of the astropaths grew louder. As the translucent field died away, Voke and I reached out ungloved hands and touched the oozing, skinless face. The veil of the warp drew back. I looked as if down a pillar of smoke, ghost white, which rushed up around me. In my ears, the harrowing screams of infinity and the billion souls cast away therein. Blue light streaked with storm fires, a sound that mingled seismic rumbling and the ethereal plain-song of long-decayed temples. A smell of wood smoke, incense, salt water, blood. A cosmic emptiness so massive and everlasting, my mind numbed as I raced across it. It was gone in a blink, just fast enough to prevent the sheer scale taking my sanity with it. Another blink. Flares of red, colliding galaxies, catching fire. Souls like comets, furrowing the immaterium. Voices of god monsters calling from behind the flimsy backdrop of space. Blink. Oceanic blackness, another snatch of plain-song. Blink. Stellar nurseries, fulsome with embryonic suns. Blink. Cold light, eons old. Blink. "Gregor?" I looked around and saw Commodus Voke. I had not recognized his voice at first. It seemed to have been softened, as if the event had humbled him. We stood on a slope of green shale, under a pair of suns that radiated enormous heat. Desiccated mountains lined the horizon, looming like fortresses. We moved across the clinking shale towards the sound of the excavator. An ancient monotask, its pistons slimy with oil, dug into the side of a rock face with shovel-bladed limbs. It gouted steam and smoke from its boiler stack and excreted rock waste down a rear conveyor belt into heaps of glittering spoil. We moved past it, and past other excavations in the rock face where smaller servitors brushed and polished fragments from the exposed strata and laid them carefully on find trays. Malahide stood watching them work. He was younger here, youthful almost, tanned and fit by the suns and the work. He wore shorts and loose fatigues, his skin streaked with dust. "I thought you'd come," he said. "Will you cooperate?" I asked him. "I've little time to talk," he said, bending down to examine items that a servitor had just placed on a tray. "There's work to do. A great deal to uncover before the rains come in a week or so." He knew who we were, but still he could not quite divorce himself from the reality around him. "There's plenty of time to talk." Malahide straightened up. "I suppose you're right. Do you know where this is?" "No." He paused. "A fringe world. Now I come to think of it, I've forgotten its name myself. I am happiest here, I think. This is where it starts for me. My first great recovery. The dig that makes my name and reputation as an archaeoxenologist." "It is later events we wish to speak of," said Vogue. Malahide nodded, untied his bandana, and wiped the sweat from his cheeks. "But this is where it begins. I will be celebrated for these finds, feted in high circles, invited by the noble and famous House of Glor to dine with them and enter their service as a prospector. Uricel Glor himself will recruit me and offer me a lucrative stipend to work for him." "And where will that lead?" I asked. "Tell us about the Saruthi." He bristled and turned away. "Why? What can you offer me?" "Nothing. You have destroyed me." "We have means, Malahite. Things can be easier for you. The House of Glor has doomed you to an unthinkable fate." He caught my eye, curious intent. "You can save me? Even now?" "Yes." He paused and then picked up one of the trays. It was suddenly full of the chipped octagonal tiles from the Damask site. "They had an empire, you know," he said, sorting through the tiles, showing some to us. The pieces meant nothing. The history is here, inscribed pictographically. Our eyes do not read it, though. The Saruthi have no optical or auditory functions. Smell and taste, the two combined, in fact, are their primary senses. They can detect the flavors of reality, even those of dimensional space. The angles of time. How? He shrugged. The Necrochuk. It warped them. Their empire was small, no more than 40 worlds, and very old by the time the book came into their possession. Carried by humans, fleeing persecution on Terra in the very earliest days. Thanks to their taste-based sensory apparatus, they derived from the Necrochuk more than a simple human eye could read. From that first taste, the profound lore of the Necrochuk passed through their culture like wildfire, like a pathogen, transforming and twisting, investing them with great power. It led to war, civil war, which collapsed their empire, leaving worlds burned out or abandoned, contracting their territory to the far-flung fragment we know today.
They are corrupted. As a species, I mean, asked Vogue. Malahite nodded.
Oh, there's no saving them, Inquisitor. They are precisely the sort of Xenos filth you people teach us to fear and despise. I have encountered several alien races in my career, and found most to be utterly undeserving of the hatred that the Inquisition and the Church reserves for anything that is not human. You are blinkered fools. You would kill everything because it is not like you. But in this case, you are right. The contagion of the Necrochuk has overwhelmed the Saruthi. Never mind that they are Xenos. They are a chaos breed. He shivered, as if a chill wind was picking up, but the suns continued to beat relentlessly. What are their resources? Their military capability? I have no idea, he said, shivering again. They abandoned their spaceship technology centuries ago. They had no further need of it. As I said, the Necrochuk had warped their sensory abilities. They became able to undo the angles of space and time, to move through dimensions, from world to world. They mastered the art of constructing spaces in 4 dimensions, environments that existed only at specific time points. Like the one where the trade was meant to take place? Yes. KCX 1288 was once part of their empire, ravaged in their civil war. They chose it for the meeting because it was remote from their main population centers. They built the tetrascape inside specifically for us. Tetrascape? Forgive me, I coined the term. I thought I might use it in a learned paper one day. A tailored 4-dimensional environment. In that particular case, engineered with a human climate. We were their guests, you see. How was the deal arranged? Locke, the rogue trader. He was on a retainer to the House of Glaw, had been for years. A mercenary, roaming the stars at the behest of the Glaws. He ventured into Saruthi territory and eventually made contact. Then he discovered the existence of the Necrochuk and knew what it would be worth to his masters. And they agreed to trade. I was becoming impatient. Time surely was running out. He shuddered again. It's cold, he said. Isn't it? Getting colder. They agreed to trade. Come on, Malahite. We can't help you if you delay. Yes. Yes, they agreed. In exchange for the return of artifacts and treasures from worlds they had abandoned and no longer had access to. Wasn't the Necrochuk precious to them? It was in their souls, in their minds, woven into their genetic code by then. The book itself was incidental. And you were employed to excavate the materials that the Glaws intended to trade? Of course. I was promised such power, you know. His voice tailed off. Beyond the distant mountains, the sky was growing dark. A strengthening breeze scattered loose shale around our feet. The rains? He said. Surely not this early. Concentrate, Malahite, or you'll slip away. The Necrochuk is destroyed, the trade prevented, and House Glaw is shattered and defeated. So why are Locke and Datso leading their fleet into Saruthi territory? What's that? He asked sharply, holding up a hand for quiet. It was indeed colder now, and chasing clouds obscured the suns. A distant, plaintive threnody was just audible.
What are they doing?
Voke spat. He looked at us as if we were stupid. Repairing the damage you've done to their cores. The high and mighty masters of the Glor Cabal have masters of their own to please. Masters whose wrath defies thought. They must assuage them for the loss of the Necrochuk. I looked across at Vogue. You mean the children of the Emperor? I asked Malahide. Of course I do. The Glors couldn't do all this alone, even with their power and influence. They made a pact with that foul legion for support and security, in return promising to share the Necrochuk with them. And now that's gone, the children of the Emperor will be most displeased.
And how do they hope to avoid this displeasure and make amends?
Voke asked. Like me, he was becoming alarmed by the stain in the sky and the sound in the wind. By obtaining another Necrochuk, I said, realizing, answering from Malahide. The archaeoxenologist clapped his hands and smiled. Brains at last. Just when I was giving up hope for you. Well done. There is another? Asked Voke with a stammer. The Saruthi happily traded back their human copy because they had their own, I said, cursing myself for not seeing the obvious sense before. Well done again. Indeed they have, Inquisitor. Malahite was gleeful and smiling, though he was clearly shivering now, and desperate for warmth. It's a Xenos transcription, of course, composed in their, I'd say language, but perhaps flavor is a better word. However, the arcane knowledge it contains is still the same. Datso and his masters will have the Necrochuk, despite the setbacks you have caused. Lightning flashed, and the wind lifted walls of dust and storms of shale particles around us.
Our time is up,
Voke cried to me. How true, said Malahide. And now, your promise. I have answered you fully. Are you men of your word?
We can't save you from death, Malahide, Voke told him. But the abominations you have chosen to align yourself with are coming to consume your soul. We can at least be merciful and extinguish your spirit now, before they arrive.
Malahide grinned, flecks of shale clicking off his exposed teeth. Damn your offer, Commodus Voke, and damn you both. Move, Voke, I cried. Malahide had simply been keeping us talking, padding his story out. He knew damn well we had nothing much to offer him, except a swift end. That didn't interest him. He wanted revenge. That was his price for speaking. He wanted to make sure we were still here when the end came. To die with him. The desert behind him ruptured upwards, throwing rock and dust into the cyclonic gale. A column of blood exploded out of the ground like a geyser, 1/2 kilometre wide and a dozen high. It rose like a gigantic tree, swirling with pustular flesh, sinew, muscle, ragged tissue, and a million staring eyes that coated it like glistening foam. Branch-like tendrils of bone and tissue whipped out from the swirling, semi-fluid behemoth and tore Malahite apart. It was the most complete, most devastating fate I have ever seen a man suffer. But he was still smiling, triumphantly, as it happened. Chapter 22. In the mouth of the warp. A mandate to purge. 56 Izar. The psychically manifested memory of the fringe world and its excavation site blurred away, shattering like an image in a broken mirror. But the towering demon form remained, keening in the lethal darkness, driving the tempest of damnation down upon us. I felt Voke lash out with his mind against the thing, but it was a futile gesture, like a man exhaling in the face of a hurricane. "Back!" I yelled, my voice lost and distant even to me. I saw him falling into the void at my side, reaching for me. I yelled his name again, holding out my hand. He cried out an answer I couldn't hear. Instead, I heard shouting, screaming, and the blast of gunfire. I sprawled painfully onto the cold paved floor of the chapel, soaked with blood and plasmic residue, gasping for air, my heart bursting. The noises now were all around me, deafening and clear. I rolled. Panic was emptying the chapel, priests and novices alike. Acolytes and retainers, all were fleeing, wailing, overturning pews. Lord Rawkin was on his feet, his face pale, and his devoted bodyguard, with their saintly masks, were charging forward, their broadswords whirring as they described masterful figures of 8. I saw Voke, unconscious, nearby. Like me, he was saturated with inhuman gore and the drooling liquor of the immaterium. I couldn't find my balance, and there was a dullness in my head. I retched clots of blood. I knew I was damned by the warp, ruined and stained. I had strayed too close too long. The astropaths were staggering backwards, frantic, shrieking. Some were already dead, and others were convulsing or hemorrhaging. As I looked up, 2 exploded simultaneously, like blood-filled blisters. Arcs of warp energy flashed among them, frying minds, fusing bones, and boiling body fluid. Malahite's corpse had gone. In its place on the plinth crouched a thrashing, screeching horror of smoke and rotting bone. The astropaths had broken the link, having staunchly sustained it long enough for Voke and I to escape. But something had come back with us. It had no form, but suggested many, as a shadow on a wall or a cloud in the sky might flicker and resemble many things in a passing moment. Inside its fluttering robes of smoke, starlight shone and teeth flashed. The first of Rawkin's bodyguards was on it, slicing with his sword. The razor-keen blade, engraved with votive blessings and curial sacraments, passed harmlessly through wispy, ethereal fog. In response, a long, attenuated claw of jointed bone, like a scythe with human teeth growing from the blade edge, lashed out and chopped through his torso and his holy blade, bisecting both. I fumbled for a weapon, any damn weapon. There was a cacophony of gunfire. Storm bolters blasting, the 3 Death Watch Marines advanced towards the horror. Their black armor was rimed with psychic frost. Over his Vox speaker, Seinwolf could be heard, admonishing the foe and barking tactical instructions to his comrades. Their chapter-wrought bolters continued to boom in unison until the unremitting fire had blasted the thing from the warp backwards in a scrambling, shrieking smear of blackness and bone limbs. It fell back off the plinth into the retreating astropaths, crushing dead and living alike. Brother Captain Seinwolf moved ahead of his companions, faster than seemed to me possible for such a heavily armoured form. Tossing aside his spent bolter, he drew his chainsword and hacked again and again into the writhing mass, driving it backwards into the adulatory stalls, which splintered like tinderwood. Lord Rawkin strode past me, wielding a ceremonial silver flamer he had snatched from one of his attendants. The acolyte ran behind, struggling to hold on to the gold-inlaid fuel tanks and keep pace with his master. Rawkin's voice sang out above the mayhem. "Spirit of noxious immateria, be gone from hence! For as the Emperor of mankind, manifold be his blessings, watches over me, so I will not fear the shadow of the warp." Holy fire spurted from the Lord Inquisitor's weapon and washed across the warp-spawned thing. Lord Rawkin was chanting the rite of banishment at the top of his lungs. Endor pulled me to my feet, and we both lent our voices to the words. There was a tremor that seemed to vibrate the entire ship. Then nothing remained of the vile creature, except a layer of ash and the devastation it had wrought. As penance for the act of transgression that had led to this warp invasion, Conrad Molitor was charged with rededicating and reconsecrating the violated chapel. The work, overseen by the archpriests of the Curia and the techno-adepts of the glorious Omnissiah, took all the first 6 weeks of our 10-week transit time to 56 Izar. Molitor took his duties seriously, dressed himself in a filthy sackcloth shirt of contrition, and had his retainers scourge him with withes and psychic awls between ceremonies. I thought he got off lightly. I spent a month recovering from the psychological trauma of the auto-seance in one of the battleship's state apartments. The psychological damage I suffered during that event lasted for years after. I still dream of that geyser of blood, clothed in myriad eyes filling the sky. You don't forget a thing like that. They say memory softens with time, but that particular memory never has. Even today, I console myself that to have forgotten would have been worse. That would have been denial, and denial of such visions eventually opens the doors of insanity. I lay upon the apartment's wide bed all month, propped up with bolsters and pillows. Physicians attended me regularly, as did members of Lord Rawkin's staff, dressed in their finery. They tested my health, my mind, my recovering strength. I knew what they were looking for. A taint of the warp. There was none, I was sure, but they couldn't take my word for it, of course. We had come close, Voke and I, close to the precipice, close to the edge of irreconcilable damnation. Another few seconds. Amos stayed with me, bringing me books and slates to divert me. Sometimes he read aloud, from histories, sermons or stories. Sometimes he played music spools on the old horn-speakered celiophone, cranking the handle by hand. We listened to the light orchestral preludes of Dominius Bartholomew, the rousing symphonies of Hans Solveig, the devotional chants of the Ongres cloisterhood. He warbled along with operettas by Gwinglas until I pleaded with him to stop, and mimed the conductor's role when the Marcherius Requiem played, dancing around the room on his augmetic legs in such a preposterous, sprightly fashion it made me laugh aloud. "It's good to hear that, Gregor," he said, blowing dust off a new spool before fitting it into the celiophone. I was going to answer, but the strident war hymns of the Mordian regimental choir cut me off. Midas visited me, and spent time playing regicide or plucking his Glavian lyre. I took these recitals as a particular compliment. He'd been dragging the lyre around for years, ever since I had first met him, and had never played in my hearing, despite my requests. He was a master, his circuit-inlaid fingers reading and playing the coded strings as expertly as they did flight controls. On his third visit, after a trio of jaunty Glavian dances, he set his turtle-backed instrument down against the arm of his chair and said, "Loink is dead." I closed my eyes and nodded. I had suspected as much. "Amos didn't want to tell you yet, given your condition, but I thought it was wrong to keep it from you." "Was it quick?" "His body survived the Seance invasion, but with no mind to speak of. He died a week later, just faded away." "Thank you, Midas. It is best, I know. Now play again, so I can lose myself in your tunes." Strangely, I came to enjoy Beckwin's visits most. She would bustle in, tidying around me, tut-tutting at the state of my water jug or the collapse of my bolsters. Then she would read aloud, usually from books and slates Amos had left, and often from works that he had already declaimed for my edification. She read them better, with more colour and phlegm. The voice she put on to do Sebastian Thor made me laugh so hard my ribs hurt. When she got to reading Kurloff's narrative of the Horus War, her impersonation of the Emperor was almost heretical. I taught her regicide. She lost the first few games, mesmerized by the pieces, the complex board and the still more complex moves and strategies. It was all too tactical for her, she announced. There was no incentive. So we started to play for coins. Then she got the gist and started to win. Every time. When Midas visited me next, he said sourly, "Have you been teaching that girl to play?" Towards the end of my third week of recuperation, Beckwin arrived in my apartment and declared, "I have brought a visitor." The ruined side of Godwin Fishig's face had been rebuilt with augmetic muscle and metal, and shrouded with a demi-visage mask of white ceramite. His lost arm had also been replaced with a powerful metal prosthetic. He was clad in a simple black jacket and breeches. He sat at my bedside and wished me a speedy recovery. "Your courage has not been forgotten, Godwin," I said. "When this undertaking is over, you may wish to return to your duties on Hubris, but I would welcome your presence on my staff, if you choose so." "Nissime Carpel be damned," he said. "The High Custodian of the Dormant Vaults may call for me, but I know where I want to be. This life has purpose. I would stay here, in it." Fishig remained at my side for hours, long into the night, by ship time. We talked and joked occasionally, and then played regicide with Beckwin looking on. At first, his problems in manipulating the pieces with his unfamiliar new limb afforded us plenty of amusement. Only when he had beaten me in 3 straight games did he admit that Beckwin, in her infinite wisdom, had been coaching him for the past few weeks. I had one last visitor, a day or two before I was finally able to walk and go about my business uninterrupted by periods of fatigue. Haldane wheeled him in on a wire-spoked carrier chair. Voke was shrunken and ill. He could only speak by way of a Vox enhancer. I was sure he would be dead in a matter of months. "You saved me, Eisenhorn," he husked, haltingly, through the Vox augmetic. "The astropaths made it possible for us to live," I corrected. Voke shook his gnarled, sunken head. "No, I was lost in a realm of damnation, and you pulled me back."
your voice. I heard you call my name, and it was enough. Without that voice, I would have succumbed to the warp.
I shrugged. What could I say?
We are not alike, Gregor Eisenhorn, he continued, tremulously. Our concept of Inquisition is wildly at variance. But still, I salute your bravery and your dedication. You have proven yourself, in my eyes, different ways, different means. Is that not the true ethic of our order? I will die peacefully, and soon, I think, knowing men such as you maintain the fight.
I was honored. Whatever I thought of his modus operandi, I knew our purposes pointed in the same direction. With a weak gesture, he beckoned Haldane forward. The man's raw, damaged head was no prettier than when I had last seen it.
I want you to trust Haldane. Of all my students, he is the best. I intend to recommend his elevation to the level of High Interrogator, and from there, Inquisitional rank beckons. If I die, look to him for my sake. I have no doubt the Inquisition will benefit from his presence.
I promised Voke I would do so, and this seemed to please Haldane. I didn't like the man much, but he had been resilient and unfaltering in the face of savage death, and there was no doubting his ability or dedication. Voke took my hand in his sweaty claw and rasped,
Thank you, brother.
As it turned out, Commodus Voke lived on for another 103 years. He proved nigh on impossible to kill. When Golesh Constantine Phepos Haldane was finally elected to the rank of Inquisitor, it was all Voke's doing. The sins of the father, as they say. Invasion training began 3 weeks off 56 Izar. Initially, Admiral Spacian's plan was for a fleet action, a simple annihilation of any targets from orbit. But Lord Rawkin and the Death Watch insisted that a physical invasion was required. The recovery and destruction of the Xenos Necrochuk had to be authenticated, or we would never know for sure that it was truly gone. Only after that objective was achieved could extreme destructive sanction be unleashed on 56 Izar. All that could be learned from my associates and the surviving Gudrunites concerning the Ceruthi tetrascapes, ironically we were using Malahite's term by then, was collated during a scrupulously searching series of interviews conducted by naval tacticians and Britnoth, the Death Watch's revered librarian and strategist. The collected information was profiled by the fleet's cogitators, and simulations created to acclimatize the ground forces. To my eyes, the simulations conveyed nothing of the wrongness we had experienced on the world of the plateau. Britnoth himself conducted my interviews, accompanied by Olm Madathine. Shaven-headed, a giant of a man, even without his armor, Britnoth was nevertheless cordial and attentive, addressing me with respect and listening with genuine interest to my replies. I tried to do verbal justice to my memories of the experience, and additionally related the theories that Malahite had expounded during that fateful séance. Eschewing the luxury of a servitor scribe or clerk, Britnoth made his own notes as he listened. I found myself engrossed watching the warrior's paw, working the dwarfed stylus almost delicately across the note slate. We sat in my apartments for the sessions, which often lasted hours. Beckwin brought in regular trays of hot mead or leaf infusions, and Britnoth actually extended his little finger as he lifted the porcelain cups by the handle. He was to me the embodiment of war in peacetime, a vast power bound into genteel behavior, striving to prevent his awesome strength from breaking loose. He would lift the cup, small finger extended, consult his notes and ask another question before sipping. The fact that small finger was the size and shape of an Arbites truncheon was beside the point.
What I'm trying to establish, Brother Inquisitor, is whether the environments of the Ceruthi Xenos will hinder our forces or deprive them of optimum combat efficiency.
You can be sure of that, Brother Librarian. I poured some more Olisette tea from the silver pot. My comrades were disoriented for the entire duration of the mission, and the Gudrunite riflemen had broken because of the place more than anything else. There is a wrongness that quite disarms the senses. It had been conjectured by some that this is a deliberate effect used by the Ceruthi to undermine sentience used to 3 physical dimensions, But the traitor Malahite made more sense, in my opinion. The wrongness is a byproduct of the Ceruthi's preferred environments. We can expect the effect to be the norm on any homeworld of theirs. Britnoth nodded and noted again.
I'm sure your chapter's experience in specialized sensor equipment will be a match for it, put in Madathene. Myself, I'm worried about the Guard. They'll be the mainstay of this action. They've all seen the preliminary briefing simulations,
Britnoth murmured. With respect, I have too, and they hardly do justice to the places we will find ourselves in. I looked across the table into Britnoth's face. His rugged features were sunken and colourless, the common trait of one who spends most of his life hidden within a combat helmet. His hooded eyes regarded me with interest. What wars, what victories had those eyes witnessed, I wondered. What defeats?
What do you suggest?
Britnoth asked. Adverse cross-training, I replied. I'd thought about it long and hard. Olm here knows I'm no military man, brother librarian, but that's the way it seems to me. Make the troops practice overburden and off-balance. Blindfold them in some exercises, cuff them in others, alter gravity in the training vaults. Make the weighted packs they carry off-center and awkward. Switch light levels without warning. Crank the temperature and air pressure up and down. Simply make it hard for them. Train them to run, cover, shoot, and reload in off-putting extremes. Make them learn all their essential combat procedures so well they can do them anywhere, under any circumstances. When they hit the ground at 56 Izar, let the fight be all they worry about. Everything else should be instinctive. Madathene smiled confidently.
The infantry forces at our disposal are primarily Navy troopers and Mayapoir light elite from the Imperial Guard, seasoned soldiers all, unlike the poor Gudronite foundees you had to nursemaid, Gregor. We'll put them through the hoops and raise their game for the big push. They've got the combat hours and the balls to do it.
Don't stint, I warned Madathene. And those foundees you refer to, Sergeant Yarus and his men, I want them with me when I go in.
Gregor, we can give you a crack squad of Mayapoir who...
I want the Gudronite survivors.
Why?
Britnoth asked. Because whatever their combat inexperience, they've seen a tetrascape. Those are the men I want at my side. Madathene and Britnoth exchanged glances, and the procurator shrugged.
As you wish.
As for the others, like I said, don't stint on the training regime.
We won't,
he chuckled, mock outraged at the idea.
The drill masters will work the regiments so hard they'll yearn for real battle.
I'm serious, I said. Every man that deploys onto 56 Izar, the venerated Death Watch included, Emperor bless them, should be ready to lose control of his senses, his judgment, his fortitude, and even his basic mental faculties. They're going to be hit hard, but in an insidious way. I don't care if every man-jack of them forgets his own mother's name and wets himself. They must still know how to hold a line, fire and reload, adore the Emperor, and respond to orders.
Succinctly put, Britnoth said. I will, of course, temper your proposals before I put them to my battle brothers.
I don't care what you tell them, I chuckled, as long as you don't let on who it came from.
Your anonymity is assured.
He smiled. A wonder, that. I consider myself one of the very few mortals to have made a librarian of the Adeptus Astartes smile. To have seen a librarian of the Adeptus Astartes smile, even. Britnoth pushed his slate and stylus aside and looked over at me with curiosity.
Mandragore,
he said. The bastard child of the Emperor? What of him?
I'm told you killed him yourself. In single combat. Quite a feat for one such as you. And I mean no disrespect.
No disrespect is taken.
How did you do it?
He asked, frankly. I told him. I kept it simple. Britnoth made no reaction, but Madathene was quietly agog.
Brother Captain Steinwolf will be fascinated, Britnoth said. I promised him I'd find out the details. He was dying to ask you about it, but he didn't dare.
Now that was funny. We prepared ourselves for the approaching war. It was going to be arduous, and unlike most campaigns, not divided into two sides. I observed training sessions, impressed by the efforts and the discipline. I even had the terrifying pleasure of watching Captain Steinwolf's kill team conduct a target decoy hunt through the hold levels. We were ready. Ready as we'd ever be. In the 9th week of transit, Lord Inquisitor Rawkin and Admiral Spatian issued a joint declaration, officially enforced by will of the Ecclesiarchy. A mandate to purge 56 Izar, as the term and parameters are understood in the Imperial codes. That was the seal on the action. There was no turning back now. We were heading through the Immaterium at high warp to invade and, if necessary, destroy the Saruthi world. Through my weeks of convalescence, I dreamed little. But on the last night, before our arrival at 56 Izar, the blank-eyed, handsome man returned to stalk the landscape of my dreams. He was talking to me, but I couldn't hear his words, nor understand his purpose. He led me through draughty halls in a ruined palace, and then departed silently into the dream wilds beyond, leaving me alone, naked in a ruin that tottered and crumbled down on me. The Saruthi were in my dreams too. They rose through the brick debris of the collapsed palace effortlessly, finding angles and pathways that I could not see. The multiple nostrils on their swaying heads flared as they got the taste of me. Their skulls coruscated with energy. I woke, soaked with night sweat, more out of my wide bed than in it. Dislodged bolsters were scattered over the floor. The Vox-link on my nightstand was beeping. "Inquisitor Eisenhorn?"
"Sorry to wake you,"
said Madathine.
"but I thought you'd want to know. The fleet exited the Immaterium 26 minutes ago. We are entering invasion orbit of 56 Izar."
Chapter 23. Invading the Invasion. Bent Angles. In the gardens of the Saruthi. The war had already begun. 56 Izar hung like a pearl in space, milky white and gleaming. Vivid flashes and slower blossoms of destruction underlit its translucent skin of cloud. The heretic fleet had arrived 2 days ahead of us, and had begun its assault of the planet. I kept thinking of it as Estrom's fleet, but it wasn't, of course. I had made certain of that. This was Locke's battle fleet now, I was sure. The 13 ships had blockaded 56 Izar in a non-standard but effective conquest pattern. Serial waves of their fighter bombers, interceptors, and dropships rained down on the planet, and the orbiting heavies bombarded the surface with their entire batteries. They detected our battle pack the moment we came out of warp. Their picket ships, the heavy destroyers Nebuchadnezzar and Fournier, wheeled round to protect their hindquarters. Admiral Spatian held our battle pack off orbit and chased the frigate's defense of Stalinvast, Emperor's Hammer, and Will of Iron straight in to clear the way. On their heels, he sent out the massed fighter squadrons of the Expeditionary Force, and diverted the battleship Valpecula to engage the enemy flagship, a heavy cruiser named the Leoncoeur. The Emperor's Hammer and the Will of Iron pincered and torched the Nebuchadnezzar after a brief but fierce exchange. The explosion lit the void. The defense of Stalinvast and the Fournier locked each other tightly in a longer, slower dance of warships, and eventually slammed together, squeezing boarding parties and naval security units into each other's hulls. The locked ships tumbled away in an embrace of death. The Valpecula raced forward and misjudged the Leoncoeur's evasion, suffering a trio of broadsides. Coming about, spilling debris into the Gulf, the Imperial battleship raised its guns and hammered the Leoncoeur so hard and so furiously that the enemy flagship broke up and blew out like a dying sun. Limping, the Valpecula turned slowly and began its long-range harrying of the enemy ships closer to the target world's atmosphere. Spatian committed the rest of his group then, ranging them forward in a 3-pronged division, of which the central and largest was headed by the majestic St. Sidus. Distances closed. The near space of 56 Izar was awash with fire patterns and the streaking comets of missiles. Now the ferocious high-velocity small ship phase began, as waves of interceptors and light bombers from both fleets met and buzzed around each other like rival swarms of insects. The tiny lights whirled and danced in the void, faster and more numerous than the unaided eye could follow. Even the tactical displays overwhelmed the senses, pick plates flickering with thousands of type markers and flashing cursors, spinning, overlaying, vanishing and reappearing. The heretics had seeded a buffer zone behind their deployment with mines, and the Emperor's Hammer, spurring forward in a fleet intruder roll, suffered heavy damage and was forced to break away. Heretic interceptors fell upon the stricken ship like carrion flies on a dying beast. The Will of Iron moved past the Emperor's Hammer and began to sweep a path through the mine zone with its specialized clearing devices. Triggered by probing force cones, the floating weapons began to detonate in their thousands. Spacian's intent was to cut a wedge into the enemy's wide formation and bring at least some of his ships within range of the planet's surface. Once that bridging objective was achieved, he could begin to unleash the planetary assault, confident of providing the dropships with some covering fire. The St. Sithis was first to secure such a position. Its main guns mercilessly disposed of the heretic cruiser Scutum and forced the carrier frigate Glory of Algol into a desperate retreat. Hundreds of dropships rushed like a blizzard out of the battleship, and the two frigates, and the inquisitorial black ship that had moved in behind it. Most of the dropships were the grey landing boats of the Imperial Guard, jets firing as they hammered down into the cloudy atmosphere of 56 Izar. But scattered among them were a handful of scarab-black landing craft and drop pods of the Death Watch. The counter-invasion had begun. Within the first hour of the war, we managed to land more than two-thirds of our 120,000 Mayapoir light elite infantry on the surface of 56 Izar, almost half of the motorized armor brigades, and all 60 Adeptus Astartes warriors of the Death Watch. Sensor sweeps showed 56 Izar to be a bland, unremarkable world beneath its heavy veil of atmosphere. Vast, low continents of inorganic ooze, punctured by ranges of crystalline upland and surrounded by inert chemical oceans. The only signs of advanced life of any kind indeed, were a string of city-sized structures arranged in a chain along the equatorial region of the main continent. The nature and composition of these structures was virtually impossible to read from orbit. The heretics had concentrated their invasion efforts on the three largest structures, and Admiral Spacian was targeting these areas, judging that the enemy would not be wasting time invading unviable sites. Losses were high. The approaches were thick with enemy interceptors, micro-mines, and the fire of surface-to-air defenses. All of this was human warfare. There was no sign or hint of any Saruthi participation at all. Behind the main landing force came the inquisitorial squads, 5 specialized assault units designed to follow the military in through the opening they made and oversee the primary objectives: the capture or destruction of the heretic conspirators, and the obliteration of any further Necrochuk material. I had control of one squad. The others were led by Endor, Shongard, Molitor, and Lord Inquisitor Rorken himself. Voke was too ill to command the squad, and his emissary, Haldane, accompanied Endor's party. My own force, designated Purge II, was made up of 20 Gudranite riflemen, Bequin, Midas, and a Death Watch space marine called Gilar. A member of the Adeptus Astartes had been seconded to each Inquisitor. Fischig had demanded to accompany me, but he was still weak from his injuries and surgery, and I had turned him down with a heavy heart. He remained on the battleship with Amos, who was, by any standards, a non-combatant. Our transport, an Imperial Guard dropship, left the St. Sithis directly behind the force-designated Purge I, in Lord Rorken's lander. We rode out the vibrating, shuddering descent, strapped into the G-chairs of the troop bay. Yerus's men sang as we dropped. Their standard-issue Gudranite uniforms had been augmented with fresh body armor from the fleet stores, and they had sewn inquisitorial emblems onto their sleeves, next to the regimental badge of the 50th Gudranite Rifles. They were in good humor, eager and determined, encouraged, I believe, by the faith I had shown in selecting them. Madathene had confided to me that they had scored consistently above average in the adverse training program. They joked and boasted and rang out imperial battle hymns like veterans. Their experiences since the founding at Dorsey had baptized them very quickly indeed. Bequin had also been transmuted by experience in the months since I had first met her on Hubris. A hard, serious woman had replaced the scatty, selfish pleasure girl from the Sundome, as if she had at last found a calling that suited her. She had certainly thrown herself into her new life with dedication and vigor. I considered the changes a distinct improvement. Many are called to the service of our beloved Emperor, and many are found wanting. Despite the ordeals, Elizabeth Bequin had proved herself. If there was a point at which her transformation could be identified, it was the plateau. The sight of Mandragore's corpse had exorcised her fears. Dressed in a black armored body glove and a long black velvet coat, she sat in the seat next to me, scrupulously checking her las carbine. The chastener had trained her well. Her gloved hands made swift, professional movements over the weapon. Only the trim of black feathers around her coat's collar betrayed a vestige of the painted, frocked, and decorated girl of old. Midas sat the other side of me, ill at ease. He made a lousy passenger, and I knew he wanted to be up in the dropship's cockpit instead of the Navy pilot. He wore his cerise jacket, despite the objections of the dour Gilar, who considered its brash colour unsuitable for combat. His needle pistols were holstered, and his long Glavian rifle rested across his knees. I wore brown leather body armour and my button-sleeve coat for the assault, a trade-off between protection and mobility. The symbols of my office were proudly displayed on my chest above my sash. Librarian Britnoth, in a gesture that honoured me, had sent a bolt pistol for my personal use. It was a compact, hand-crafted model with a casing of matte green steel. The rectangular pattern magazines slid into the hand grip, and I had one locked in place and another 8 in the loops of my belt. After 8 minutes of violent descent, we levelled out, and the vibrations diminished. Gilar, seated next to the ramp hatch, made the sign of the Aquila in the air and locked his helmet into place. 20 seconds, the pilot announced over the cabin vox. We soared down, free of the clouds, and into the fire and darkness of the near-surface war zone, moving at full burn towards one of the orbitally identified city structures. The site was ringed by a series of what seemed to be colossal lakes or reservoirs, and the liquid they contained was ablaze, with raging walls of fire reaching up thousands of meters. Night-black smoke fanned from the fires and blocked the immediate daylight, and the world below was amber-lit by the seething flames and the crossfire of weapons. The dropship shook as the braking jets fired, and we lurched around in a drunken yaw before settling. Gilar thumped a wall stud, and the ramp doors opened with a yowl of metal on metal. Cold air and smoke blew into the cabin. We came out onto a wide, glistening flat of white mud that squelched wetly under our running, jumping boots. The mudflats lay between two of the burning lakes, and we could feel the heat of the immense fires on our faces. The coiling flames reflected in dazzling patterns off the wet mud. Burning debris from a crashed lander littered the white flats, as well as the charred bodies of several Mayapois. Lasfire cut the air above us. A kilometre ahead, there were the familiar shapes of raised, hoop-like arches. Tetragates, as they had been dubbed by the fleet's tech priests, some shattered and broken by the assault. Beyond them rose the pearl-white flanks of a great edifice, the target structure, curved and segmented like a gigantic seashell, spotted with 1,000 tiny scorch marks and blast scars. We advanced behind Gilar. The air smelled of fuel vapour and another rich scent, like licorice, that I couldn't readily identify. Purge 2, deploying on surface at chart Mark 7, I reported over the Vox. Understood, Purge 2. Purge 1 and Purge 4 report safe landing and deployment. So, Rorken and Molitor's groups were down. No word yet of Endor or Shongard. As we pushed past the first of the shattered hoops, Gilar faltered, pausing to shake his helmeted head. I could feel the wrongness already, the insidious twisting of the Ceruthi environment. It seemed likely the effect was being accentuated by the broken tetragates. These silent devices projected and sustained the Ceruthi tetrascapes, and they were now faulty and incomplete. The Gudronites noticed it too, but seemed unfazed. "Take point," I told Yerus, and Gilar looked at me sharply. "You need time to get used to this, Brother Gilar. Don't argue." Yerus and 3 Gudronites moved into the vanguard. Even they were having trouble, shambling awkwardly as if intoxicated. The angles of space and time were truly bent and twisted here. Behind us, thrusters retched, and our dropship rose off the gleaming mud, its ramp and landing struts folding up into its belly. It was barely 60 meters up when a missile struck it amidships and blew out its mainframe. The burning cockpit section tumbled away from the airburst and fell into a lake of fire. Metal debris from the destroyed main section peppered the white mud below. But for the grace of the God Emperor, we could all have been aboard it. Moving at an unsteady trot, we came to the Ceruthi edifice. Its great luminous form was the size of an imperial hive, and its foundations ran down beneath the white mud. I tried to get a sense of the structure, but it was no good, and I quickly gave up rather than risk disorientation. It was like an ammonite with its polished segments and perfect curves, but my human eyes could not read its true shape. The overlaps and edges did not meet as one would expect, and conjured distracting optical illusions when any attempt was made to follow them from one point to another. We reached the foot of it. There were no doors or entrances, and those who had come before us had tried to blast their way through the lustrous surface, only to find it apparently solid within. I moved my squad back from the barrier, and we retraced our approach down the line of the tetragates. Those nearest to the structure were still intact. As I had anticipated, we stepped through the last one and were immediately inside the edifice, as if we had passed through the pearly walls. Inside, there was a low radiance shed by some source inside the walls. It was warm, and the smell of licorice was more pungent and intense. The floor, translucent and pearly, was concave and flowed up into the curve of the walls. We moved forward, weapons ready. The corridor, and I use that word in the loosest sense, seemed to describe a spiral, like the inner form of a great conch or the canals of a human ear, but at no time did we feel anything but upright. Opening into a horn-like cone, the spiral gave out into a huge, almost spherical chamber. It was impossible to estimate its true size or define its true shape. It seemed to be some kind of ornamental garden, or even farm. Silver walkways, suspended invisibly by gravity or some other force, ran between curving tanks of liquid that formed beds for huge, multicolored cycads and other bulbous, primitive plants. The fleshy growths towered around us, dripping with moisture and swathed in creepers and climbing succulents. Ropes of vine and beards of flowering foliage hung from invisible fixtures in the air above the beds. There were insects in here, flitting between the swollen bell shapes, crescents, and columns of the gigantic vegetation. One landed on my sleeve, and I swatted it, noticing with revulsion that it had 5 legs, 3 wings, and no symmetry. We followed the silver path. It passed through a tetragate, and at once we found ourselves in another garden chamber, similarly filled with glossy, abundant plant life, thriving in sculptural tanks. The tallest growths in here, giant yellowish horsetails streaked with orange veins, rose 80 or 90 meters above the floating pathway. Gila called a word of alarm, and his storm bolter began to fire, raking across this second chamber from the silver path on which we walked. The shots burst gourd-like plants in fibrous bursts of sap and hacked shreds of leaf and tendril into the air. Return fire came at us, las fire and the crack of auto-rifles. Through the sickly growths of this indoor jungle, the soldiers of the heretics moved against us. Chapter 24. Purge 2 engages. A silent revolution. Datso's triumph. They came through the plant growth along the silver paths, blasting, men clad in the stained uniforms of the 50th Gudronite Rifles and the black armor of the Naval Security Detail. 2 of the Gudronites in my squad toppled and fell from the path, their corpses disappearing into the oily waters of the tanks below. But most of the enemy gunfire was going wild. Purge 2 countered, las guns barking. I moved to the front of the group and began firing my bolt pistol. There was precious little room for maneuver on the silver walkway, and even less cover. My first shot went wide, so wide I wondered if the bolter was misaligned. Then I remembered the devious nature of the Ceruthi tetrascape, and compensated. 2 shots, 2 satisfying hits. Bequin and Midas both had the trick of it too, and Eurus's boys were learning. Gila made a lot of noise, ripping through the gardens with his storm bolter, but it seemed to me he was still discomforted by the environment. It was a salutary moment, to see one of the godlike warriors I have regarded with great awe ever since the day, 30 years ago, when I watched the White Scars take Almanadai, become fallible. For all his power, courage, superhuman vigor, and advanced weapons, he was achieving nothing, whereas Yelton, the youngest of the Gudrun boys, had made 3 kills already. Was it arrogance? Overconfidence in his own abilities? "Gila! Brother Gila! Adjust your fire!"